Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for attending our webinar on compliance with the hospitality industry wage order. My name is Subha Vishwanathan from Schoeneck King Syracuse office, and my partner John Ho is from our firm's New York City office. Let me just tell you a little bit about our firm and who John and I are. We're a statewide law firm. We've got about 230 or so lawyers, about 70 of whom focus completely on representing employers in labor and employment issues. And John and I happen to be two of those 70, and we happen to have represented several employers in the hospitality industry. So we thought it would be a good idea to put together a webinar to address some of the unique issues that restaurants face that other industries don't face, particularly under the Department of Labor's hospitality industry wage order. So we appreciate you taking the time to attend. Let me just give you a brief overview of what we're going to cover. First, we're going to cover tip credits, how much you can take as a tip credit, what requirements exist to enable you to take it, what occupations qualify for the tip credit, those sorts of issues. Then we're going to talk about call-in pay, when it is required, how much is required. Same thing with spread of hours pay, what the requirements are for spread of hours pay. Then we're going to talk about uniform maintenance pay, how much you have to pay, what exceptions there are. And then we're going to talk about what limitations there are on meal and lodging credits. So I'm going to turn it over to John to kind of give us a general intro regarding the type of liability that could result from not following the wage order.
Thanks, Subha. So before we take a look at some enforcement activities at the audit level, of course, these issues can be attacked. Employers can be attacked in really two ways. The first is through a Department of Labor audit, and second, of course, is through a very active plaintiff's bar. Either way, as some of you may know, the statute of limitations in New York for these kinds of claims is 6 years, which actually is the longest in the country. So clearly, New York employers in particular should be very vigilant about making sure that we're doing everything, properly in the hospitality wage order, given the, the extended statute of limitations. And also, it's not just the back wage that you have exposure to, but under both the FLSA, which is the federal law that governs, and the New York labor law, the state counterpiece, there's 100% assessment of liquidated damages, which is presumed to actually attach. So that means that if an employee recovers $5,000 in back wages, it's presumed that he's going to get an additional $5,000 in liquidated damages to quote-unquote make him whole for not receiving the money in the first instance. So it's not punitive like you may hear in some Title VII cases, but rather it's compensatory. And of course, there's also interest, which if the New York State Department of Labor brings is shockingly 16%, and 9% if it's through a private lawsuit. So if we turn to some enforcement activities, you can just see some numbers here, which I think shows the staggering amount of audits that these issues have really addressed. In 2012, 280 million wage and hour violations. Of course, this is not just a New York issue; it's across the country. Other Department of Labor's 172 million, and in many states, including New York. The state attorney general can also get involved, and you can see some of the numbers here. And as I alluded to before, a very active plaintiff's bar is probably your quote-unquote biggest fear, if you will, because of they really consider this sometimes low-hanging fruit. And I would just mention one thing on the state attorneys general. It's somewhat uncommon in New York and in other states, but there are criminal provisions under these wage and hour laws that employers need to be aware of. And New York actually, although it's still very rare, the state attorney general office has in recent years brought some criminal proceedings for particularly egregious offenses. And so again, although it's uncommon, it's something that employers should be aware of. So we take a look at the next slide. We can see some of the private lawsuits that we're talking about. Here there's, and again, I think what comes forward from these slides, whether it's Hooters, Water's Edge, which is a small restaurant in Long Island City, a DoubleTree Hotel, which is obviously a large chain. I think the point is no matter how big or small you are, you're a target. There are a number of law firms that specialize on the plaintiff side. One's called WaiterPay.com, which is based here in New York, that we deal with somewhat commonly, that has a website dedicated specifically to informing people in this industry, employees in this industry, of their rights. So we can take a look at the next slide. Again, here, just some more numbers for you to digest and just sort of appreciate the breadth of what's going on here. McDonald's, of course, everybody knows that, multi-billion-dollar chain has been sued a number of times. There's also, again, smaller restaurants in the New York area that have been subject to these kinds of suits. So I think the point here is no matter what your size is, these issues are going to affect you. And then we take a look at the next slide, and as Suba mentioned, there's a specific wage order that covers the hospitality industry in New York, and anyone who operates in this industry, if you don't have a copy of that, I would strongly suggest printing out a copy just to have on hand. It's a great reference point, and again, it specifically addresses nuances and regulations that may only exist specifically in the hospitality wage order. So specifically, there are some changes that we're going to talk about. Tip credit rates and the amount of permissible allowances against the minimum wage for tips. Are going to get into this a little bit more. The amount of required uniform laundering and maintenance pay. The regulations are very specific on exactly how much needs to be paid, and it sometimes varies in complicated ways, for instance, on how many hours the employee is scheduled to work. There are specific tip credit amounts that affect employees in the hospitality industry. We're going to get into this a little bit more. And I think, again, the regulations, if you take a look at them, are very precise on not just what the tip credit is, but the type of employee that is getting the tip credit, right? So the regulations define something that's different between a food service employee, somebody who's, as the language suggests, regularly handles food, like a waiter, like a busboy, versus, say, a valet who never is touching food, and they have different rates, things that you have to be aware of. And we're going to talk about, and Suba is going to talk to you a little bit about the definition of a service employee too, and that's generally somebody who is eligible to receive tips. So if we take a look at the next slide, some basic requirements of the hospitality wage order. Hopefully you are all now aware that on December 31st in 2014, which of course just passed, the minimum wage went up in New York. So now it's $8.75, and it's again going to go up on December 31st of this year, but it's currently $8.75. So we're going to talk about the tip credit and how that to reduce an employer's minimum wage obligations, but putting that issue aside, everybody in New York needs to be paid at least $8.75 an hour. So overtime, of course, means that they have to be paid time and one half the regular rate to all employees who work over 40 hours in a work week. And the work week is a 7-day consecutive period that the employer is entitled to establish, whether it's at, it could start at midnight at Sunday and run through 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, which is a very common work period, but it doesn't have to be those days. It can be whatever you want to set it, but it's a 7-day consecutive period, and of course the overtime threshold is 40 hours of actual work for that week. And we have employees in parentheses because the wage order specifically excludes certain employees from certain protections, and there are a number of exclusions, but the ones that we're most commonly are used are what's called the white-collar exemptions, the executive, administrative, professional exemptions, and we could spend a whole webinar talking about exemption issues, but just know that some of these laws do not apply to exempt employees, or really more technically employees who are individuals who are excluded from the definition of employees under the hospitality wage order. Extra pay, New York specifically has a few provisions that don't exist under federal law, and under certain circumstances, a New York employer must add extra pay to wages at any pay level. And we're going to talk again in more detail about some of these, the call-in pay, spread of hours pay, and the uniform maintenance pay issues. One thing New York has, again, in the hospitality wage order is a requirement that all employees, again, except exempt ones or those who are excluded from the definition, and also excluding commission salesperson, must be paid at an hourly rate of pay. And historically, that wasn't in there. That has been a change, not in this last version, but a couple of years ago they did make that change. So That's important to know, again, that salary, weekly rates, and other piece rates are impermissible if you are defined as an employee in the hospitality wage order. So the definition of, again, does not include exempt employees as executive, administrative, professional, and outside sales, and the regulations specifically define who those are. Again, this particular webinar goes beyond those issues, but just note, for instance, like an executive chef who directs and controls and supervises people in the kitchen is, very well could be an exempt employee. It may not be covered by some of these requirements. And your general manager, for instance, is somebody who is generally going to be covered under an executive exemption. So some of these rules may not apply to them, but to the extent you are an employee, you will have all of these issues, regardless of whether if they're making, $50 an hour or tip credit making only $5. So if we go to take a look at the next slide. Those are some of the basic requirements. Let Suba talk to you about some of these definitional issues.
John, so the definitions and particular classifications under the hospitality industry wage order are extremely significant because of the amount of the tip credit and whether or not you're even allowed to take a tip credit for those particular classifications. So let's go through the particular classifications that are in the wage order. The first is food service worker, which is defined as any employee who is primarily engaged in the serving of food or beverages who also regularly receives tips. And that would include wait staff, bartenders, captains, busing personnel. There's a specific exclusion for delivery persons. So even though, technically you might consider a delivery person to be working with food and actually serving food to customers, they're actually excluded from the definition of food service workers because really the definition is intended to only apply to kind of in-house personnel as opposed to delivery people who go out of the establishment to serve food to customers. So that's food service worker. A service employee is anybody who, other than a food service worker, who customarily receives tips at the hourly rate of at least $160 on or after January 1st, 2011, $175 on or after December 31st, 2013, $190 on and after December 31st, 2014, and $195 on and after December 31st, 2015. So those people, could be considered people like valets, bellboys, housekeepers. Those sorts of individuals would be considered service employees, but not food service workers. Non-service employees is anybody else. So any employee other than a service employee or a food service worker. And the employer, keep in mind, has the burden of proof to show that an employee receives sufficient tips to be classified as a service employee, which is why you should have, if you have service employees and food service workers, you should have some procedure in place for employees to self-report their tips on a periodic basis so that you can confirm that they're making at least the minimum amount of tips to cover them for the tip credit. You don't have to confirm the accuracy of what they're reporting to you. As we all know, many employees tend to underreport their cash tips to their employer. For your purposes, the only reason for that reporting is to make sure that they're making at least enough in tips to allow you to take the tip credit. It's not to determine whether they're paying their taxes or anything like that. So, for your purposes, you don't have to confirm the accuracy of it. You just have to confirm that it's at least minimally sufficient to enable you to take the tip credit. So in general, front of the house employees may be service employees and who are eligible to receive or share in tips. And those are the employees who are visible to customers and part of the service of the customer. And that could include not just the wait staff, the individuals who pour drinks, and it could also include the hosts or hostess. It includes busing personnel. Those are the front of the house people who are eligible to receive or share in tips. Back of the house employees like dishwashers, cooks, those individuals are not considered either food service workers or service employees. So they can't be part of a tip pooling or a tip sharing arrangement, and you cannot take a tip credit based on their hourly wage. Those employees in the back of the house have to make at least the minimum wage of $8.75 per hour currently, and then at least the $9 an hour as of December 31st, 2015. So even if you pay a tipped employee the $8.75 minimum wage, that does not mean that that they're not eligible to keep their tips. So under New York law, tips and gratuities are the property of those who earn them, regardless of whether you take the tip credit or not. So there's no such thing as, well, I'm paying this person the $8.75 minimum wage, so their tips belong to me. Keep in mind that employers can reduce the minimum hourly rate obligation for eligible tipped employees by using a tip credit, as long as the total earnings of that employee, the hourly wages plus the tips, are at least equal to the minimum wage mandated by law. So in other words, you can count those tips as part of the minimum wage. And again, that makes the tip reporting extremely important, because if you don't have some sort of mechanism for employees to report the amounts of their tips, if you're audited by the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor asks you, what do you have to confirm that these individuals, that the hourly wage you're paying them plus their tips at least equal the minimum wage, and you don't have the documentation to show it, it's going to be tough for you to refute an employee who says, well, I was only making $1 per hour in tips. So you really should make sure that you have some sort of self-reporting mechanism for the amount of the tips.
Suba, can I just add a couple of points there?
Yeah.
The first is, Suba talked about the definition of service employees, and you saw that last slide that said the tips are the property of those who earn them. One issue that has come up is, well, what if I have a general manager who provides service, right? So they have the power to hire or fire, but maybe you're a small restaurant, so that general manager, for a good part of the time, maybe seating tables, maybe helping out behind the bar. If they are, in fact, an agent of the employer or general manager, they cannot be part of the tip pool, even though they have service duties. So that's, and again, particularly for smaller restaurants, but it could be true for larger ones as well. So that's an issue we've seen come up, somewhat frequently. So I just want to make that point clear.
Yeah, that's a good point. Keep in mind that when you give the employee a pay stub, the pay stub has to reflect the amount of the tip credit. So with every payment of wages, it's got to show obviously the hours worked, the rates that are paid, the total gross wages. Any credits that are claimed have to be reported on the pay stub, as well as any deductions and the final amount of net wages. So here's why the distinction between a food service worker and a service employee matters. For instance, if a restaurant is misclassifying their delivery persons as food service workers and only paying the $5 sub-minimum wage, the restaurant is actually underpaying the delivery people by 65 cents an hour, which could result in significant back wage liability as well as liquidated damages. And as John mentioned, we're talking about a 6-year statute of limitations. So, if you add up all of your delivery people for 6 years, 65 cents per hour, that could potentially be, a large sum in back wages. So, so it's really important to understand who's a food service worker, who's a service employee, and understand what tip credit you're allowed to take for each classification. So, currently for food service workers, there's the sub-minimum wage is $5, and you're entitled to take a $3.75 tip credit. For service employees, the minimum wage is $5.65, and you're entitled to take $3.10 in tip credits. And for service employees in resort hotels, there's a $4.90 wage and a $3.85 tip credit, as long as the tips average at least $4.90 per hour currently.
And Suba, if I could, one thing I would add here too is, as Suba noted, if you mess up, if you will, some issues with the tip credit. You could lose the tip credit, but you also can have disgorgement damages, meaning that, if, for instance, if you let in a dishwasher into the tip pool, whatever tips that ineligible employee took would also, not only do you lose the amount of the tip credit, but you would also have to put back in that disgorgement value again. So that's why some of these numbers become quite staggering, even for smaller, restaurants that don't have a lot of employees, because they really do add up. And again, there's been a couple of cases, one in Pennsylvania recently on expediters, right? People, and that is a term of art. I mean, you can call somebody a captain, an expediter, a waiter, or whatever it may be, and ultimately, it's at the end of the day, it's the duties that they perform that define it. So the title is not dispositive, but expediters can be in the back of the kitchen arranging the food and may not come out that much. In other restaurants, they may come out and provide direct service. But those are the kinds of issues that we're seeing when it's not so clear cut that's a food service worker. Maybe there's a blend of duties. But again, if ultimately they are not considered a food service worker, it's not just the loss of the tip credit, but it's also the disgorgement that under the state law that you would have to account for as well.
Right. We've already talked about keeping records of employees' tips. You're also required to provide a notice informing employees that a credit for tips is being taken. And it's actually a notice that's kind of in addition to the labor law section 195 pay notice. And there is a sample notice right in the hospitality wage order in section 146-2.2 of the wage order. There's a sample notice right there. So, I think a good practice is to use that notice when you're providing your tipped employees with their wage notices. And that, if you don't provide the notice, it has the potential to completely invalidate the tip credit for those particular employees, which again can add up to significant liability if you're paying the tipped minimum wage but haven't provided the notice to support it. On any day that a service or food service worker works at a non-tipped occupation for 2 hours or more for more than 20% of his shift, whichever is less, the wages of the employee are not permitted to be subject to a tip credit for that day. And that kind of goes a little bit to what John was saying about expediters or other personnel who are working in the back arranging food for part of the time and then perhaps coming out and being a front of the house person for part of the time. So let's look at this example. And this is a trap that restaurants can fall into. This particular employee is entitled to be paid the regular minimum wage of $875 per hour because in this particular circumstance, they spent an hour and 45 minutes in the morning doing food prep, which is not a tipped occupation. 9:45 to 1:30, they were serving food, which does qualify them as a food service worker. And then they take their half-hour meal period. 2 o'clock to 4:30, they're serving food again. So for the 8 hours of time worked, an hour and 45 minutes was in a non-tipped occupation, which is more than the 20% of the 8-hour shift. So in this particular circumstance, if the restaurant paid the employee at the food service worker sub-minimum wage of $5 an hour, the employee was actually underpaid for that day by $30, even if the amount of tips received by the employee was more than sufficient to cover that extra $30. So obviously, if this happens on a consistent basis where you've got food service workers in the back spending more than 20% of their time preparing food or cooking as opposed to actually serving, there's, again, a potential that you're going to lose that tip credit for those days that it happens. So what do you do to avoid it? Try to designate the incidental and non-tip related work to the employees who are paid at the $875 minimum wage. Alternatively, if it's unavoidable to have your food service workers doing some back of the house duties like food prep or dishwashing or whatever it might be, consider documenting day by day what they were doing during each portion of the day, whether it was dishwashing, food service, food prep, whatever it might be, so that you have some basis to confirm that the employee was not spending more than 20% of their time on non-food service related duties.
And
keep in mind also, go ahead, John.
Just to beat that point home again on the disgorgement, so you can see in Suba's example, in that situation, if you were taking a tip credit, that individual would have a right of action because he can say, wait a second, I wasn't an eligible tipped employee, so I should get the difference between the tip credit you're taking and the minimum wage, and his inclusion in a tip pooling agreement would then create a cause of action for all those others because he was also an ineligible employee. So his tips, again, all the tips that he received, not just the tip credit, if in a lot of high-end restaurants, but not even high-end restaurants, the tips obviously generate a fair amount of the income, and it could be significant in a day. So all that disgorgement goes back, creates a cause of action for those other people in that tip pooling arrangement. So again, the problem is creating an issue with the person themselves, but also the others that are all in the tip pooling. And that's why it's very important to make sure that we've got a comfortable grasp on the eligibility issues, because you can see very easily how the damages can get significant very quickly.
Yes, definitely. For tipped employees, the overtime rate is always 1.5 times the minimum wage rate minus the applicable tip credit. So you can't just take the, for a food service employee, you can't just take the $5 an hour tipped minimum wage, multiply that by time and a half, and pay $7.50 for hours worked over 50. The correct computation is here on this slide, which is you take the $8.75, multiply that by time and a half, then you subtract the tip credit, and you get $9.38 per hour. So for this particular employee, their total wages, if they worked 50 hours in a week as a food service employee, their total wages would be $293.80. I'm going to turn it back over to John to talk about call-in pay and spread of hours pay.
Okay, so again, call-in pay is one of those nuances that New York has, and other states may have similar language or maybe even identical language, but this is, we're going to talk specifically about New York's call-in pay, and again, specifically the hospitality industry. So what is call-in pay? Well, call-in pay, the wages owed to an employees for reporting to work on any given day, even if they are sent home early or assigned no actual work. So, in the usual instance, if somebody's scheduled Monday through Friday from 12 to whatever it is, 4 or 5. If they come in at 12, they're going to be entitled to call-in pay under certain conditions. And the call-in pay it's a minimum wage pay, so if they're entitled to the call-in pay, as we're going to talk about, it's going to be at $8.75. And unlike certain kinds of eligible tipped employees, you can't take a tip credit or a meal credit or a lodging credit, which Suba is going to talk a little bit more about at the end of the webinar. The call-in pay is a standalone pay that once they are entitled to it, they have to get it with no allowances against it. So we take a look at the next slide. Again, sort of, what is it? Well, the applicable wage rate means, so they're going to be paid for the time of actual attendance, calculated at the employee's regular rate or overtime, whichever is, applicable, minus the tip credit. So that's essentially the time worked times whatever their rate is, and if they're working over 40, then it's the right overtime rate that Suba just talked about. Or you're paying the payment for the balance of the period calculated at the basic minimum hourly rate with no tip credit subtracted. So if they're working their regular shift, then you move to the first one. If they're entitled to this call-in pay provision, then you owe that minimum wage of the call-in pay, $8.75, with no tip credit. And then in a second, we'll explain that a little bit more and flesh it out with another slide. But an important point here that we wanted to share with you, of course, is that employees who voluntarily leave work early are not entitled to any amount of call-in pay. So obviously, if somebody's scheduled from 12 to 4 and they come in at 12 and they get a call and one of their kids is sick and they have to leave, even though they may have been there, even though they went to work, because they are voluntarily leaving early, they're not entitled to the call-in pay. So you would want some documents, right? In the employment world, there's a saying that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. But it doesn't have to be a tremendous amount of documents, but just even a note to that person's file or in the record for that day. John left early to take care of a personal issue. So there's some kind of contemporaneous document that you can point to and say that's why he left and that's why I don't owe the call and pay for the day. So the next slide is, well, how much is required? We talked about how do you pay it. And here again, as I alluded to earlier, the hospitality wage order can be convoluted in ways that don't exist in other wage orders. And here's sort of an example, because the amount that you owe is actually determined by the number of hours in the regular shift. So just looking at the slide, so they must be paid the call-in pay if they're 3 hours for one shift, the number of hours in the regularly scheduled shift, whichever is less. So 6 hours for two shifts, totaling 6 hours or less, or the number of hours in the regularly scheduled shift. Again, this is all whichever is left. Then there's the 8 hours for three shifts, totaling 8 hours or less, or the number of hours in the regularly scheduled shift, whichever is less. So you just look at the three. So let's take the first example, right? So if they're regularly scheduled for 4 hours, say they're regularly scheduled from the 12 to 4, well, obviously the lesser amount there would be the 3 hours for the one shift. And if that's the case, then the call-in pay would be triggered, and we do the same analysis again as the regulations show for the number of hours in the shift. So the next slide talks about, well, what is the regularly scheduled shift, or what does that mean? Well, it means the fixed repeating shift that an employee normally works on the same day of each week. If an employee's hours worked or scheduled to work on any given day of the week change from week to week, there's no regularly scheduled shift. So if it fluctuates with no consistency, then obviously there is no regularly scheduled shift, and we just look at the other numbers to determine the amount of the callback pay, if it's triggered, and how much we owe. One thing I would just tell you from practical experience, not that, I don't think a lot of employees try to do this intentionally, but the department will be weary if you're always avoiding call-in pay by saying, well, the employee's only really scheduled for 2 hours. Now, you can have an employee come in every day for 2 hours, but, most employees aren't going to agree to a 2-hour schedule because it's generally it may not be worth it to come in for just 2 hours. But this week they're only scheduled for 2 hours. So that could be possible, but just make sure that, in fact, if you have an employee scheduled for less than the 3 hours, which is the minimum you saw on the previous slide, that, in fact, that is fixed and recurring, because, again, auditors will be somewhat skeptical that people would agree to work under a 3-hour shift, although it is possible, but I just give you that as a practical point, because most people are going to be scheduled for more than 3 hours on a regular basis. So the next slide is the spread of hours pay, and many of you may have heard of this, but spread of hours pay is also 1 additional hour pay at the minimum wage, which of course now is $8.75, to an employee when the length of time between the beginning and the end of the workday is greater than 10 hours. So a couple of important points here is the length of time includes any time off duty, including meals, rest periods, or time even between shifts. So if somebody starts work at noon and they even give them a 2-hour meal break in between, which of course if it's a bona fide meal period, you generally don't have to pay for that time. It's not compensable. It's duty free. They can go off grounds and eat or whatever it is. But if they're scheduled from 12 and then they go on a meal period from 4 to 6, but they don't end until 11, even though the compensable work time may be under 10 hours, that whole time that they were at the premises, including the split shifts, are required to be there, exceeds 10, then the spread of hours kicks in. And again, this is a minimum wage provision, so it's at $8.75, and once you owe it, you owe it. And we can stay on that other slide, Suba, and talk about whether it can be avoided. Another thing is that if an employee crosses a day, one work day to another, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever it may be, then the spread is also triggered. So you can actually set an employee's work day. You can use different work days for different people. Generally speaking, if you have overnight, if you're a restaurant that's open 24 hours, this may apply to you. If you're not in an overnight situation, you probably have less to to worry about here, and you generally aren't going to be able to avoid it. Again, as long as they're on the premises, even with a split shift that exceeds the 10 hours. But if you do have overnight shifts, then employees may change the employee's predetermined workday. And here you can see what there's an example of a tavern may define its workday as 5 a.m. To 5 a.m. to coincide with its operations, which means that an employee who works an 8-hour shift between 8 and 4 is not working a spread because it's all taking place in 2 calendar days. So that's, again, this is really if you have sort of overnights and shifts that are over midnight and you want to break it up, you can set your 24-hour period. It doesn't have to coincide with the calendar day. But otherwise, if it triggers, then it's owed. It's $8.75, and many years ago there used to be an offset where if you had paid an employee more than the minimum wage, say $12 an hour, you could use that difference between 8 and 12 to satisfy your 1 hour at the basic minimum wage rate. That no longer exists. Now it's absolutely clear in the hospitality industry, if you owe this 1 additional hour, and it's only 1 hour per spread, right? So if somebody is on your premises for 12 hours, you only owe 1 time payment of $8.75. You don't owe it twice because they're over 2 hours. Same thing if it's 11 hours, if it's 13 hours, if it's 14 hours. Once it's triggered, it's just a one-time, $8.75 payment. So we can move to the the next slide that talks about these little, but this is the uniform pay. So yes, that's the 2 points you just want to take home. There's no offset. It's $8.75 once you owe it. You owe it, and again, you have some ability if you've got shifts that go into overnights that you have some ability to separate the workday so it doesn't necessarily have to coincide with the calendar day. And then Suba is going to walk you through the uniform pay and the lodging issues.
So uniform maintenance pay, the purpose of it is to cover the cost to an employee of maintaining required uniforms worn on the job. So obviously we've got to start with what exactly is a uniform. And the definition under the wage order is clothing that the employer requires an employee to wear at work that would not normally be considered part of an ordinary wardrobe. And we'll talk about what ordinary wardrobe means as well. But keep in mind that it doesn't have to be a complete outfit. It could include a shirt, blouse, pants, jacket only. If you mandate that the employee wear a certain article of clothing at work, then this uniform maintenance pay is going to kick in. If the employer doesn't maintain the employee's uniforms for them, then they have to pay the uniform maintenance pay, subject to some exceptions, which we'll discuss. So what is ordinary wardrobe? It's clothing that meets all of these 3 criteria. It's ordinary basic street clothing, has to be selected by the employee, and it has to be allowed to vary in details of the dress. So, for example, if you tell employees that they're required to wear a white shirt and either black pants or a black skirt at work, and you tell the employee you go out and you get your own white shirt, you get your own black pants or black skirt. The employee can go out, they can wear that for non-work purposes. They can select a particular style of white shirt they like. They can select a particular style of black pants or black skirt that they like and that they would be willing to wear for non-work purposes. That would likely not be considered a uniform. But if you detail to them what the pants have to consist of or what the skirt has to consist of, exactly what type of shirt they're required to wear, then that would likely be considered a uniform. The definition of a wash and wear uniform is important because there is an exception to the uniform maintenance pay requirement for wash and wear uniforms. Those are clothes that the employee can almost literally just stick in the washing machine and dryer with their other personal clothes and just take them out and wear them without having to iron them or do anything else to them. But the exception only applies if the uniforms are provided in sufficient number to cover the average number of days per week worked. This is so that you don't give the employee one uniform, even if the employee can stick it in the laundry and wash it with their other clothes. If they're scheduled to work for 5 days in a week, you're basically requiring them to do laundry for every night for 5 nights in order to get their uniform ready for work. So if the employee is generally scheduled to work five days a week, you got to give them 5 uniforms so that they don't have to do laundry multiple times in a week. Here are the pay rates that are applicable for uniform maintenance pay, and it varies depending on how many hours the employee is scheduled to work. And keep in mind that you only need to take the actual hours of work into account. You don't have to take into account call-in pay hours or spread of hours pay. So it's not required, as we talked about the wash and wear exception. So if you provide them in sufficient number, they can just stick them in the laundry and wash them with their regular clothes. You don't have to provide the maintenance, uniform maintenance pay. There's another exception where the employer offers a free and readily available laundry service in writing. You got to provide a written notice of it, and the employee declines it as long as the employer launders the uniforms with reasonable frequency and ensures the availability of an adequate supply of clean and properly fitting uniforms. So if you offer the laundry service in writing, you do it sufficiently often, and the employee says, nope, I'd rather wash them myself, you're excused of the obligation to pay uniform maintenance pay. Keep in mind that to qualify for the exception, you have to provide a sufficient number of fresh uniforms for an average work week. And fresh means that the uniform is unworn since last cleaned. And if you have higher standards of cleanliness, for example, if you require all employees to wear white shirts without stains throughout a shift, and it's very common to get stains on a white shirt, during the shift, and there are times when an employee might have to actually change a shirt or change a uniform during a shift. The Department of Labor may actually impose an obligation to provide even more uniforms than the number of shifts worked during a particular work week. So let's talk about meal and lodging credits. These are credits that an employer can take for meals provided to an employee or lodging provided to an employee. The credits are higher for resort hotels than for all-year hotels. And one very important part of this is that the employee has to be given the option of bringing his or her own food and eating it on premises. So if you don't allow employees to bring their own lunch, and you mandate that the employee, if they want to eat, they got to eat the restaurant's food, you're not entitled to take a meal credit for those meals, because the employee has to at least have the option to bring their own food if they want to. Resort hotels are hotels that offer lodging accommodations to the public or to members or guests of members, and that meet any of the following 2 requirements. The hotel operates for not more than 7 months in a calendar year, or the hotel is in a rural community or in a city or village of less than 15,000 population, and the hotel increases its number of employee work days or guest days during any consecutive 4-week period by at least 100% over the number of days in any other consecutive 4-week period within the preceding calendar year. Basically, that's just a fancy way in the wage order of saying, these are hotels in small communities and that are either open for only a certain number of months, not more than 7 months in a calendar year, or these are vacation destinations for tourists, essentially. All-year hotels are really any hotels that don't qualify as resort hotels. These are the maximum amounts of the meal credit for various types of classifications. Keep in mind that a meal, you can't just offer a bag of chips or snacks and call that a meal and take a meal credit. There's actually a very specific definition in the wage order. Meal is defined as adequate portions of a variety of wholesome, nutritious foods It's got to include at least one of the types of food from all 4 of the following groups. First, fruits or vegetables, grains or potatoes, eggs, meat, fish, poultry, dairy, or legumes. And I'm not 100% sure what legumes are, but I'm sure you guys know it since you're in the restaurant industry. And the 4th is tea, coffee, milk, or juice. You know, that's what a meal is. At least it doesn't mean that you have to monitor to make sure that the employee is eating all of those 4 particular groups, but those have to be made available to the employee to qualify as a meal for purposes of the meal credit.
Suba, can I add one thing there on the meals?
Go ahead, John.
You know, Suba had made the point before, which, you know, again, it's important that the employee has to be given the option to bring in his own meal. But, you know, there's nothing in the regulations that allow an employee necessarily to switch back and forth every day, right? So as a practical matter, I'm okay with, you know, saying to the employees at the beginning, right, having them sign some acknowledgement form, like, look, we offer meals here. If you want to opt into our plan, great. We will take whatever, you know, the applicable amount is, which, as you can see, is, you know, not a lot. I mean, it ranges depending on who the employee is, but a couple of bucks, $2.50 to $3.10 or whatever it may be. I mean, I think it's clear that, you know, they're going to spend more than that anywhere to eat their meals. So I found that when you say to the employee, you can say, well, do you want to use our plan here, sign it. You don't have to, but you can't opt back in. But this isn't like we're going to give you a daily choice. You don't like what's on the menu. And if you do it that way, I think, you know, more often than not, you'll find that employees will opt in because, again, they unless they have some, you know, food allergy issues, that's just going to make that, doesn't make sense to them. Most will. So it's that flexibility doesn't go to an everyday thing, and you can give them that plan. And again, I would just have that documented. So I just wanted to make that point as sort of as a practical matter.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the hospitality wage order actually addresses that. You know, essentially, what a meal is considered to be furnished. Your obligation is to furnish a meal, and it's considered to be furnished when it's made available to the employee and, quote, customarily eaten by that employee. So, as John said, if you allow an employee to basically opt into you know, a meal plan, you don't have to monitor on a day-to-day basis whether the employee brought their lunch or ate the meal that was furnished. It's customarily furnished. It's furnished if it's customarily eaten by the employee. So, so that's your only requirement. It's enough that you make it available and it's customarily eaten by the employee. Keep in mind a few other things on the meal credit. You can't take more than one meal credit for any employee who works less than 5 hours in a day. And you can't take a credit of more than 2 meals on any day, except that a credit of 1 meal per shift may be permitted for an employee working on a split shift. So if you've got an employee who literally works breakfast, goes home, works a lunch shift, goes home, and then comes back on a dinner shift, you potentially can take 3 meal credits if the meal is customarily eaten by the employee on those 3 shifts. Residential employees in resort hotels, if the compensation is based on the inclusion of meals, have to be provided with 3 meals a day. To take the lodging credit, keep in mind that the living accommodations have to meet generally accepted standards of habitability, sanitation. That kind of goes without saying. And here's just kind of a list of lodging credits. And again, job classifications matter because the difference, there's different lodging credits based on what the individual's particular classification is and whether you're a hotel or a resort hotel. So I see we're past our time a little bit, but we're happy to take a couple of questions if there are any. Well, I don't see any questions. So I think we're going to sign off. And again, we appreciate you taking the time to attend our webinar, and we hope you have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Stay dry.